and welcome to Round Around We Go. I'm Emily, and I use she, they pronouns.
And I'm Paul, and I use he and him pronouns.
And today we are going to be looking at Earl's Court Station. So before we begin with Earl's Court, last week when we were doing Hatton Cross, we talked about Earl's Court being on the District and Piccadilly line. But if you don't know the tube map particularly well or know Earl's Court well, it would be useful probably to look it up right now because that kind of doesn't tell the whole picture. Where Earl's Court is at, not the Piccadilly line, the District line branches off into, 6 different destinations it can terminate from. So it's very much in the center of kind of a spider web of the District line. So if you can't picture where Earl's Court is, I take a look at the tube map just because it'll be hard to get your head around things, I think, unless you have that in your head. But without further ado, I'm going to let Paul do the rundown of facts of Earl's Court Station.
So Earl's Court Station is on the Piccadilly and District lines. It opened on the 30th of October 1871, with the Piccadilly line then opening on the 15th of December of 1906. Earl's Court is in fare zones 1 and 2, and in the London Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. In 2019, Earl's Court served 19.13 million passengers, and it has full street-to-train level access. The station was designed by multiple architects, including for the roof over the platforms John Wolfe Barry. The Earl's Court Road entrance building was designed by Harry Wharton Ford. The Warwick Road entrance building was designed by Stanley Heaps, and the Piccadilly line platforms were originally designed by Leslie Green. The origin of the name is from the Earl of Oxford's manor house, which was in the vicinity until the 16th century. The area gaining the name of Earl's Court Village after them. Earl's Court Station is served by buses 74, 328, 430, C1, C3, N31, N74 and N97. And the Labyrinth, which Emily can listen to,
Yay, I found that one already,
is number 128 out of 270 and can be found in the main ticket hall.
The history is really what we want to focus on with the station because the station has such a long and rich history. We're going to start with some history, some general history, and then we're going to break it down into a lot of firsts because there's a lot of famous firsts that Earl's Court Station has. But before we get into the history, there's more than that. There's this sort of complicated, I put it as you could fill like a 6-series Netflix thing with the drama between the district, what was called the Metropolitan District Railway and the District Railway and all the railways at that time. You know more about that than me.
And there's an awful lot of confusion about it. Yeah, we could definitely fill a whole different podcast with that.
And I feel like I've now tempted you to start a podcast about the drama of the District Railway, but we will not get into that. I'm sure some people might be salivating at the idea, but we're not getting into that right now.
When we've done another 269 stations, then we can get onto that.
It's 268 once we're finished this one.
Yeah, but they'll have built more by the time we finish.
Okay, fine. Let's not get into that. Okay, so the station. So essentially, just on the District line, you had a branch that went from West Brompton to Gloucester Road. You can still see that on the tube map, West Brompton to Gloucester Road. There was this kind of farmland villagey. It was very empty, really, at the time between those places, but it was starting to populate more, and this demand sprung up for a station at where Earl's Court is, and Earl's Court was built.
Yeah, and the original Earl's Court Station was actually very simple. It was just 2 wooden platforms in the cutting with a wooden station building, and it was all on the east side of the current Earl's Court Road Bridge. And the station opened on the 30th of October 1871. Now,
yeah,
that's quite a funny thing because there's a lot of confusion over that exact opening date.
Yeah.
If you look in the various histories of the London Underground, about half of them say the 30th of October and the other half say the 31st of October. And I think this was finally decided for us as which one to go for when, in fact, a friend of mine, Neil, managed to find a cutting from the Pall Mall Gazette from the 31st of October 1871 saying Earl's Court Station had opened yesterday.
Well, so that's a primary source. That's a definitive answer, hopefully. I mean, I'm sure there was probably a soft open or something like that. But yes, we're going to say the 30th of October. Unfortunately, there was no exciting Halloween run for the opening. And then that didn't last long, did it?
No, because only 5 years later, 30th of December 1875, that's 4 years later, the original station burnt down.
This is why you don't build train stations out of wood, but I digress.
Indeed. And had to be kind of temporarily patched up. I don't think it closed down after it burnt down, but it was recognised that a new station needed to be built, not only to replace the one that had burnt down, but also because what had been a little village surrounded by market gardens was quite rapidly developing into what was considered quite an attractive area for people to live, kind of on the outskirts of London, but quickly able to get into the centre of the city by this handy railway that ran through. And also the original station had been flawed because there were 4 tracks on the District line in this stretch between West Brompton and Gloucester Road through Earl's Court, except they were running in a narrow cutting with kind of high walls on either side of the tracks, and where they went through Earl's Court Station, to squeeze in both platforms and tracks, they had to reduce it down to 3 tracks so they had space for the platforms, and that meant it was a bit of a bottleneck for the trains.
Yeah.
And because, as Emily's mentioned, it was a really complicated set of services on the Metropolitan District Railway and some other railways that also ran trains into Earl's Court at the time, some of the mainline railways, and some of the kind of middle circle, outer circle, the different permutations of the circle line. There was a lot of shuffling trains around in only 2 platforms and 3 tracks, and so they needed to rebuild the station to have a lot more capacity, both to serve all of these different trains and for the growing area. So they completely rebuilt Earl's Court Station with a new building, which opened on the 1st of February of 1878. And the station building from then, by one of these architects with quite wonderful names from the time, or at least the chief engineer of the Metropolitan District Railway of the time, who was overseeing the construction of the station, John Wolfe Barry.
It's not that exciting of a name.
I like these double-barreled names.
Yeah, that's because you have a double-barreled name. But I think, the wolf part is fun.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's not that exciting. Anyway.
And it was a new brick station building, which was now facing the west side of the Earl's Court Road Bridge, and where the station is today, which is described as being quite cheap and plain in construction, which was the fashion at the time, apparently, out of white Suffolk brick. And that station building isn't there anymore today, but what is there is the huge glass and iron roof over the platforms, which also designed by John Wolfe Barry. It's a kind of peaked roof, unlike some of the stations on the District and the Metropolitan. They have arched roofs, and this one is sort of unusual in being a peaked roof. And it was built...
It's quite beautiful, really, if you take the time to look at it.
It is really fantastic. It's a bit like, well, I guess it's almost like one of the big mainline stations, like St Pancras or somewhere, but shrunk down quite a bit. And a lot of the early Metropolitan stations and the District stations would have been like that. But it's one of the few that sort of survive in that form still. And it was rebuilt now with 4 tracks. They expanded the cutting to make it wider, 4 tracks going straight through, and then 2 island platforms which are between the tracks, so that the trains going in the same direction on each side share platforms, so you can change trains without having to go up and over the footbridge, which is quite handy.
That feels like a fairly early use of that. Obviously, it was early in the train development, which became such a standard thing on, the underground. Not a standard thing, but it is a thing you find on a lot of places in the underground. So I'm wondering if that was the first time they did that, but I don't know.
I think they were innovating very quickly all throughout that Victorian era, and there were some solutions they had which are kind of very convenient for the passengers, but seem almost a bit crazy these days. Like they used to have 2 platforms with kind of 3 tracks, so that if you'd have like track, platform, track, and then you could change trains by like going out of one train, across the platform, through the train in the middle, and then onto the train on the far side.
You can still do that at Stratford. That's the dream, doing that at Stratford. Everyone loves it.
But this was in the timetables. Like it was a set time that 3 trains would come in at once, so people could change back and forth. That's very coordinated
training. Yeah. I don't know if the trains... if they got them that coordinated, it's very impressive.
There's even tales of them parking trains next to each other so people could climb out of one train and straight into the other. And then trying to stagger the trains so people couldn't do that.
What I'm picturing, and I assume you've never seen Footloose, but there's a scene in Footloose where there's a guy there's 2 trucks and he's got his foot in one and another. I'm imagining that with trains, which is highly dangerous, but probably something some kind of daredevil tried at some point.
Probably in a sort of Wild West movie. Which, intriguingly, brings us on to the next part of the story of Earl's Court. Because it was quite handy that they'd completely rebuilt the station, because it was about to get a lot busier, because there was a large area of land sort of to the west of Warwick Road near to Earl's Court, which was owned by the District Railway.
I think let's just clarify quite quickly that one side of Earl's Court is Earl's Court Road, and the other side is Warwick Road.
Yes.
And actually today those are one-way roads, so you can only go southbound on Earl's Court Road and only go northbound on Warwick Road, which is annoying if you're trying to change buses there, but I digress there. So sorry, yes.
To the west of Earl's Court Station, there's Warwick Road. To the west of that was a whole load of land owned by the District Railway. And from 1887, they started leasing that out to be used for all sorts of different exhibitions. The first of which was the American Exhibition and Wild West Show, which was put on by the famous Buffalo Bill and involved all sorts of tricks, riding and that kind of stuff. And not people jumping between trains, but probably people jumping between horses and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm sure that was a big attraction at the time, you know. I think America, the sort of the frontier, was kind of a very exciting idea for people. I don't know, I mean, obviously there were a lot of early films made about that, which makes me think it would probably be very popular at the time.
Yeah, I mean, apparently these exhibitions became so popular that it reached a point where the income of the District Railway was entirely dependent on how popular the exhibition at Earl's Court was that year. Because each of these successive years, they would have exhibitions basically from May through to October or November. And if it was a really big draw, then they got lots of passengers. And they had a revenue sharing deal where the railway would sell tickets for both travel to Earl's Court and then admission, and they would get some percentage of all the revenues.
That's interesting, because obviously that's something that some railways still do today with tourism things. So it's always interesting to me how far back these sort of innovations, so to speak, go.
Yeah, and it was interesting sort of exhibitions as well, because they were the kind of thing that these days it seems a bit almost, I guess, beyond the Wild West show. It kind of got a bit dull. They had like a French exhibition, an Italian exhibition, a German exhibition.
Yeah, but you
all
couldn't,
about
you
different
couldn't
European
take
countries.
a Ryanair flight to these
Exactly,
countries.
you couldn't go to these places.
It was a long journey to go there. I guess we should bring that back, you know? You can't fly anywhere right now. Well, I was listening to a Rough Translation podcast the other day where the host, Gregory Warner, was talking about how he's been reading travel guides because he misses traveling so much. We could bring back it.
This is an entrepreneurial idea for the summer. Well, probably for last summer.
Someone listening to this is going to steal it from us, but whatever, it's fine.
And that exhibition also eventually played a bit of a role for the London Underground, because they built an exhibition hall called the Empress Hall, because, of course, this was the British Empire, and we've got to mention empresses and so forth, which was Queen Victoria. But they built the Empress Hall, which later on in the 1920s was used for mock-ups of new tube station designs.
Which is quite fun. New tube station designs much better than the British Empire. Let's make that our sort of mission statement for this.
I like that mission statement, yes. Building tube lines, not empires.
Yes, I like that. I mean, let's not talk about the legacy of railways and empire, but that's its own podcast.
That's a whole different mess.
Yes. One of the wildest things about Earl Court was this plan the District Railway had to create their own deep-level underground railway. Yeah,
so back in the end of the 19th century, they realised they needed to electrify their line. Steam engines just weren't enough to haul the number of passengers that were using the district line. They could only manage like 18 trains per hour. They needed more. Obviously, steam trains and tunnels was really unpleasant. They were getting competition, even from horse buses. People preferred to go on a horse bus than on the district line by this point as well. They hadn't paid any money out to their shareholders since like the 1880s, and that wasn't a good position for them to be in. But because they had no money, they couldn't afford to electrify their line either. So the plan that they came up with was, let's build a deep tube version of the district line, which would start from Earl's Court. The trains would come in from the outer ends of the district line, hauled by steam trains to Earl's Court. The steam locomotive would uncouple. They'd couple on a brand new electric locomotive, and then it would leave Earl's Court, heading east, go down a slope into a tube tunnel, and then it would go through this tube tunnel, just one stop at Charing Cross, and then it would terminate at Mansion House, which were two of the stations on their line that they seemed really wedded to.
It's such a wild idea, because it's First of all, it's basically redundant. It seems to me like they saw some express horse bus or express kind of carriage and thought, maybe we could do that, but with railways and build this entire massive underground infrastructure just for 2 stations that are really far apart. Or maybe they looked at what was going on with what became the Waterloo and City line and thought...
Well, and later on, of course, the New York subway ended up with 4 tracks. You could have express trains and local trains. It was kind of a precedent for that.
I mean, you could, but I can understand express trains and local trains, which you still have on the Metropolitan line, on the same tracks, not necessarily the same tracks, but the same tunnels. Well, they're not on tunnels at that point, but they're, in the same area. But having them building a second tunnel, deep level tunnel below the cut and cover tunnel. I mean, it feels unsafe. There's so many things that seem to not make any sense about that plan. But
I think the only sense in it was financial. It was the only way they could raise the money was if it was a whole new railway.
And then, of course, they wouldn't have to pay extra money because they'd still have the stations there already as much.
Yeah.
They just make people be able to go down deeper, make the lift slower or whatever. But I think it's a wild idea.
Yeah, and it's one that would have been really cool in a way had it taken place, like changing locomotives and then the trains continuing onwards underground with an electric loco and that kind of thing. But
I mean, you say it would have been really cool. You would have never experienced that, and then we would just have this oddity of the system, which would massively overcrowd Earl's Court, and they'd probably end up changing it or closing it anyway.
Well,
it would have been cool if you could travel in time, which we'll get to later.
And of course, it didn't end up happening because what instead happened was the District Railway got taken over effectively by Charles Tyson Yerkes, the American financier who started buying up a lot of the underground projects in London at the time. And he also took control of the scheme called the Brompton and Piccadilly Circus Railway, and he combined that with the Great Northern and Piccadilly Railway,
Great Northern
and Strand Railway, and the Deep Level District Railway to form the Great Northern Piccadilly and Brompton Railway, which is now what we call the Piccadilly line, and that took over some of the right-of-way for the Deep Level District.
I think we're going to get into that more detail when we hit some more central Piccadilly line stations, because that's its own can of worms to open.
But in short, the bit of route that would have been used for the Deep Level District largely got used instead by what's now the Piccadilly line instead, which is a far more effective use of that plan to build the tunnels. And it ended up, of course, with the Piccadilly line, which opened on the 15th of December 1906.
Yes.
Which stops at Earl's Court. And they decided to rebuild the station again, with the current station building
just for the fun of it.
Well, I mean, why not?
We don't have any money, so let's rebuild this station.
Now they had lots of money, though, because Charles Tyson Yerkes had come along with his literal bags of cash from the United States.
Ran away from Chicago because he ripped everyone off and was a massive swindler. But...
Indeed. But, we weren't into asking too many financial questions back then. If you've got money, brilliant.
We're not into asking too many financial questions now, but let's not go there.
And, of course, they then commissioned another architect with a brilliant name, Harry Wharton Ford, because I do like the double-barreled names. And he was the sort of chief architect of the District line at the time, and he designed other stations like Barons Court, for example, and he had a style with kind of buff-coloured faience, it was called.
What does that mean?
It basically means sort of pale brown tiling, terracotta-style stuff on the facade of the station. Now, the interesting thing at Earl's Court is that he was working with another architect, Leslie Green.
Yes, now he is very famous on many, many underground, a lot of those lines owned by Yerkes, so those red, oxblood red tiles you get on the front of so many stations on the Piccadilly and the Bakerloo were his, but he didn't design the outside of this building. We will probably get into him in a lot more detail on other stations, but he didn't design the outside of the building. He just designed the platforms, and his platforms are very famous for having their own specific tiling designs for each platform, which made them sort of recognizable and branded and easy to know where you are because there's not a lot of signage on them and those sorts of things. So he was doing the platforms here at Earl's Court, but he wasn't doing the station building itself.
But he did influence Harry Wharton Ford, because if you look at the frontage,
an early influencer,
Court, indeed, you can see that it has arched windows up at first floor level in the same style as you'll find on all of the Leslie Green stations, which Harry Wharton Ford never included on his other stations. But because this was both a District and a Piccadilly station, he had this kind of Leslie Green element with the arched windows, but then in his style with the buff-coloured frontage rather than the Leslie Green Oxblood Red frontage. So it's a nice mix-up.
I'm now just thinking about what an Instagram influencer Leslie Green would have been. You know, he'd be putting pictures of all his sort of arts and crafty inspired ideas and these tiles he was buying. People would have been so into it. I would have been really into it.
He would have been incredibly cool.
He also was very good looking. I mean, he only died when he was 33, but which is very sad. But yeah, he would have been great on Instagram. Sad that time didn't work that way. The other part of the station that is interesting is the opposite side. So the station we were talking about, the one that was designed by Harry Wharton Ford, is the sort of ticket hall side, which is on Earl's Court Road. But the other side, where the exhibition hall is, there is another entrance, the Warwick Road entrance. And it's this sort of weird rotunda shaped thing. It looks very modernist. And that was built by Stanley Heaps in 1937. Stanley Heaps is interesting in the history of the underground, because he seemed to kind of get told what to do, and he wasn't very innovative in himself. Actually, I quite like a lot of his stations, but they are very much, this is what other architects on the line is doing. You do something that looks like them as well. And in fact, this exit looks like stations that are designed by Charles Holden, who was one of the architects who designed the sort of extensions usually of the Piccadilly line and farther out stations on the District line as well. And so we don't know them. We found some sources that did say that Charles Holden was kind of helping him out, or as I would say, holding his hand. I'm sorry I had to do that. But we're not sure if it was just him or if he was influenced by Charles Holden. But he created this other exit or entrance that would have led to the exhibition hall.
Yeah, in fact, that was replacing an original 1887 entrance from when the exhibition grounds opened. That had been a kind of simple brick building with a kind of wooden walkway leading all the way from the platforms. And that all got rebuilt in the 1930s to replace it with this new brick and concrete, Stanley Heaps, Holden-esque rotunda. And then that was connected now by a new, again, brick and concrete walkway connecting it up from the main platforms. And then at the same time, they also built a new subway running underground, which connects the platforms going beneath the tracks and actually right inside the exhibition at the time. And there would have been escalators coming up through a new ticket hall that was under the exhibition centre and directly into the exhibitions for passengers going to them. And, well, that was also very handy, of course, when there's not just rain falling on your head, but bits of bombs falling on your head, because then, during the Second World War, from 1942 until the end of the war, that subway was converted into an underground factory, where London transport workers, after the end of their shift, in their spare time, they would come along to this subway beneath Earl's Court Station and make bits of aeroplanes. It was a kind of sub-factory to something called the London Aircraft Production Group, which was actually based in Chiswick Bus Garage and was making parts for Handley Page Halifax bombers, which are busily being manufactured by London Transport.
I mean, that's incredible, really, to think about that amount of dedication and volunteering after what, I mean, probably was longer than 8-hour shifts of people working, going, yeah, okay, I'm going to spend my spare time building more parts. So you think, I mean, there's a lot of propaganda around the war and people coming together and things, but there is a lot of people making extra efforts like that.
And literally fighting for their lives, I guess, and their freedom. And they were doing everything they could.
Now, that tunnel no longer exists. Well, the exhibition centre no longer exists, but that tunnel no longer exists either.
Well, it's no longer open to the public.
Yes, I mean,
it is still there.
Yes.
And it has been closed since the exhibition centre was demolished to make way for lots of flats, of course. Surprise, surprise.
Ooh, fancy luxury flats
it's still
in
there.
London? Who would have thought?
It's still there. It's got escalators which have those wonderful sort of bronze uplighters on, of the style that used to be common in the tube
like
in the 30s.
Like the ones in Swiss Cottage and stuff?
Absolutely, yeah. Fantastic bit of design. It's still got a little ticket office up there.
If you can't tell, Paul has gotten to go in there.
I have, because it was opened up for Open House Day by London Underground back in 2019, and I got to be one of the volunteers helping out with that, so I got to have a good look around. It's occasionally used for filming as well, so there's lots of sort of fake posters in there and that kind of thing.
Sounds pretty amazing. Now, the last thing we want to point out when we talk about the history is the very fun bit that is the TARDIS on Earl's Court Road right in front of the station. For those who aren't Doctor Who fans, and I feel like the Venn diagram, that they're going to be very close together, people who are Doctor Who fans and who might listen to this podcast. There is a TARDIS. If you don't know what that is, just Google it. You need to see it, really. But it's a blue police box that travels in time and space outside of Earl's Court Station. And this was actually built by the London Underground staff. It was apprentices, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was apprentices at the Lillie Bridge Depot, which is, I can't believe I just said depot. I would say depot. I am betraying my Canadian accent. The Lillie Bridge Depot, which is just sort of down towards Acton. And made of wood, which one would assume, installed in 1996. And it was a rundown area at the time, and I think it was kind of something to brighten it up, I guess.
I think it was, both brighten it up and also to use as a little, police...
So it actually was a
substation. Yeah, it was literally to be used by the police. They had CCTV cameras on the top to observe the area. And, apparently the London Underground station manager at the time was very keen on it, as it helped reduce the amount of crime that was going on. It's interesting you say built out of wood, obviously. The original ones from back in the early 20th century made out of concrete.
Were they?
Yeah. But
the ones, I've seen the ones that are on the streets in Glasgow, and they're definitely wood. But I don't know if they're...
I think the London ones were obviously a bit more solid than the Glasgow ones.
Who cares what happens in Glasgow?
Yeah.
Ooh, is that not the UK Parliament? Anyway, this is getting too political. So it cost $11,000 to make, and it's been out of use since 2000, which means it was only used for 4 years. But, a fun bit to have there. And we thought, because this station has so many memorable firsts, to go back and visit those, we would hop in the TARDIS. And, it's bigger on the inside, so of course we'll both very easily fit in there. And all of you can all come with us. And let's hop back to some big firsts that happened in this station.
We recognize this isn't a TARDIS noise, but it's copyright of the BBC, so we're just going to stick with the train noises as usual.
So we've arrived back in 1895 in our TARDIS. We are not going to act this out. We are not actors, but we did want to travel back in our TARDIS to 1895 to what was a big first.
Yeah, it was the first really large Ferris wheel in the United Kingdom. And I have to caveat that with the first really large Ferris wheel, because the big wheels we see at fairgrounds that are quite tall, it seems there'd been a kind of few hand-powered wooden versions of those that have gone back to probably the 18th century or so. But the first proper huge one in the whole world was built in Chicago in 1893. Designed by George Washington Gale Ferris.
Because everyone named themselves after George Washington.
Of course.
That was a trend.
And they had to go for full-on, 4 parts to the name, not just double-barreled.
Well, you had, George Washington Carver, and you've got this guy. I'm sure there were lots of people like that.
Yeah, it was obviously the popular patriotic name to go for. But his name lived on not for the George Washington bit, but for the Ferris bit, because, of course, all the Ferris wheels are named after him. And the Earl's Court exhibition grounds, always looking for something new and exciting, decided that they would build an even bigger, huge wheel, which was officially known as the Gigantic Wheel, that opened in 1895.
That does what it says on the tin, doesn't it? The Gigantic Wheel. I love it.
It was 94 metres tall.
Yeah.
So you could go, enormously high up and look over the scenic surroundings of Earl's Court.
So if you try to get a picture of what that is, if you picture the London Eye, which pedants like Paul will point out is not technically a Ferris wheel.
Because it's only supported on one side, not on both sides.
Yeah, because there's a river. Anyway, the London Eye is 135 metres, so it's smaller than that, but it is still very significant.
And it would have been bigger, though, than the big wheel, which you'll pronounce properly.
The Riesenrad im Prater. I don't know. I used to live in Vienna briefly, and that's the giant Ferris wheel in Prater Park in Vienna that people probably most famously know from the film The Third Man. But it's sort of a landmark of Vienna.
So this was a really huge wheel. It had 40 carriages suspended around it. 10 of those were first-class carriages, which cost twice as much, and they were luxuriously furnished with easy chairs, settees, etc.
That is the most British thing I've ever heard.
Of course. And the others were standard class and half the price. And they didn't just have all the carriages on the wheel. At the top of the sort of big support legs, there was supposed to be a restaurant on one side and a promenade on the other, and you would get to them by going up a funicular railway up the side of the support leg. But it seems they never actually finished that, because as far as anyone knows, it never went into operation.
That high. That I can't even picture that. That's wild.
Yeah, it was a kind of classic Victorian grand bit of public engineering, basically. And like spectacular bits of engineering, it didn't always work entirely perfectly, because quite famously at the time, on Thursday the 21st of May 1896, the wheel failed with about 300 people in it, and something like 70 people in the cars up at the top of the wheel were completely trapped until midday the following day. So they were there overnight. Apparently a man and woman who were stuck there overnight, who'd never met each other before, ended up getting married some point later.
I mean, they would... If you're in a Ferris wheel that long, you'd have to do some fairly private things in front of other people. I guess it's a very Victorian thing. I guess you're forced to get married then. It's yeah, I can't imagine that being very pleasant.
But what really did, well, you say not very pleasant, but they got paid £5 compensation to everyone who was stuck overnight, which was quite a draw at the time. So in fact, the next day, when the wheel was operational again, there were 11,000 people queuing for a ride on it, hoping that it would break down, and they would either get the compensation or meet the love of their life, one or the other.
I love that. That's such a human thing.
And it did draw a lot of people in the end. 2.5 million passengers rode on the wheel in total. But its fortunes were pretty dependent on how many people were coming to the main fairgrounds in Earl's Court at the time. And eventually the number of passengers on the wheel declined, and it was closed and demolished in 1906. Which is a pity, because I think it would have been such a spectacular sight to see. And it could have been a symbol of the city like the London Eye is today.
There is still a little bit of evidence at the at Earl's Court Station of the wheel, though, and that is in the canopies that stick out. Is it on both sides, or is it just the Ward Road?
It's just on the Earl's Court Road.
They have tiny little Ferris wheels on them, and I didn't realize this until Paul pointed it out when we were cycling past Earl's Court one day. And they're just this tiny little detail that's a nice little reminder of what was once there. So let's hop back in our TARDIS and travel just a little bit farther forward in time to 1900. We could have just stayed and ridden the wheel the entire time, because I think that would have been, I mean, it would have gotten old quickly, and the food options probably weren't great back then.
They did serve tea.
Neither of us drink tea.
This is true.
Anyway, maybe they had cucumber sandwiches.
Maybe.
They're not good sustenance, but I love a cucumber sandwich. Anyway, so we are going to travel forward to 1900 to another first at Earl's Court Station, which was the first electric train on one of the cut and cover lines.
They were running steam trains since the Met opened in 1863, the District opened in 1868, and as I said earlier, it was pretty unpleasant having steam engines running in tunnels. They needed higher frequency of trains, which couldn't be achieved with steam locomotives. They needed to attract more passengers as well. They weren't making any money. And eventually, in the very end of the 19th century, in 1898, there was an agreement between the Metropolitan Railway and the District Railway to have a joint trial of electric trains, because, of course, they jointly operated the Circle line. So they would need to use the same electrification system for both of their railways.
They didn't get along that well, though, did they?
No.
So I feel like we're not going to get along unless we can save money by doing this trial together, and then we'll force it to work.
Yeah, money forced them to cooperate briefly on commissioning this short test track for electric trains, which would run between Earl's Court and High Street Kensington Station. And they chose this little stretch of track because they thought it would be perfect for testing the electrical system, but it was easy to kind of separate from the rest of the railway. It wouldn't interfere too much with all the other services that were running. So they laid down the electric conductor rails to provide the electricity. Now, if you look at the tube today, you'll see that there's always two rails for the wheels to run on, and then there's two electrical conductor rails. There's one that goes down the edge of the track outside the running rails, and that carries the positive electricity, and there's a negative rail which runs between the running rails. So you've got four in total. Yeah. They tried something a bit different originally. They would have had both of the rails outside the tracks. You'd have power rail running rail, power rail. And apparently they tried this method partly because the motors in the electric train would be so big that they wouldn't be able to fit them kind of on top of a central conductor rail, because they were really sort of testing out different electrical technologies back then. They built a power station down at track level, kind of just past the west end of the platforms of Earl's Court. So it was all a very localised little system. And they bought a 6-carriage electric train with equipment made by Siemens, which, no sniggering, is an interesting fact because, of course, Siemens today, the German massive engineering conglomerate, is providing the new generation of tube trains for the Piccadilly line.
I used to stop I used to pass a station called Siemensstrasse in Vienna because that was where the big factory was there.
Yeah, I mean, they've got a long heritage of providing electrical equipment, both in Germany and Austria and the UK, all over the place. And they built this electrical equipment for this train. The actual carriages were built by a company called Brown, Marshalls and Co. There had been a motor coach at either end, which was powered, and then unpowered carriages in the middle. And it started running passenger services between Earl's Court and High Street, Kensington, the 21st of May of 1900. And this is interesting because this is when we get to the fact that they had already been running electric trains on the deep tubes since 1890, a decade previously. Mm-hmm. Because the District line thought their electric train was sufficiently novel they could charge passengers a shilling to ride on their test train, which is 12 old pence, when you could normally pay 2 pence to ride on a proper journey anywhere you wanted to go on the City and South London. That's
quite a steep.
Indeed. I mean, imagine it being like 6 times the price of a normal tube fare today to ride on the special train that's of a sort that's already running everywhere else anyway.
I mean, as a person who takes really weird roundabout journeys so I don't have to go into Zone 1, I'd be going nowhere near that.
And indeed, nobody did turn up. They had no passengers at all for the first week, so they decided they would have to go back to charging people the normal price. And even so, it attracted a few passengers, but never had many riding on it because it wasn't all that novel compared with the City and South London Railway and the Waterloo and City Railway, and then the Central London Railway as well, which were all running electric trains anyway. So it ran up until December of 1899 when the experiment came to an end, but was deemed successful because they did then go on to electrify the entire rest of the District line and the Metropolitan line after having a lot more arguments between them, which is perhaps something of a story for another podcast.
About drama between railways in the Victorian and Edwardian period. That's what we need, some more of that. So we are going to hop back in our TARDIS a little bit farther forward in time to the 4th of October 1911. Now, people who know a little bit about Earl's Court Station, this tends to be what they know. It's in a lot of the sort of overview fact books about the underground and things like that, is the fact that the first escalator on the network was at Earl's Court. And this was between the District line and the Piccadilly line. And actually, the way they built this was really, really interesting. So what they did is from the surface level, they dug a narrow shaft that went down to the Piccadilly line level. And then they could use this shaft, so when they continued to dig the wider shaft that the escalators would actually go in, they would put the dirt into the narrow shaft, drop it down to platform level, and take it away on trains on the Piccadilly line. They could also use this shaft to bring from trains, because obviously you don't want to create a sort of chaos in bringing things in and shutting down the whole station and things like that. So they could bring in the cast iron segments. They were going to line the tunnel that the escalators would be in. They could bring those in on trains, and then they could bring them up the narrow shaft, and then as they continued to dig, they would fill it out and make the tunnel. So it was actually a really interesting way to do it, using the trains of the Piccadilly line, meaning that you could be more efficient and not really interrupt the station too much.
Yeah, it was a very clever way to install the escalator shaft without, as you say, causing all of that disruption, which is the kind of challenge that people still have to cope with when building new bits of stations today. So nice to see that kind of thing has been going on for so long. So once the shaft had been constructed, then they could install the escalator itself. And this was the first escalator, proper escalator, anywhere on the London Underground. Now, there had been, back in 1906, an attempt to build a weird kind of spiral travelator sort of thing at Holloway Road Station, which is a story for when we get to there on the podcast.
Yeah.
And there had been in Earl's Court Exhibition Centre something that was, again, it was sort of sloped travelator, basically. So, again, a little bit of a first for Earl's Court going on nearby. And indeed, there had been a spiral escalator running as a sort of public display funfair attraction in Earl's Court as well. So it's got quite a lot of escalator history going on around Earl's Court. But yeah, the first stepped tube escalator was at Earl's Court Station. And it wasn't quite how we imagine escalators today, because, these days you get to the top of the escalator and you walk straight off. Back then, instead they had something called a shunt, which is where you got to the top and there was an angled wall in front of you that forced you to step off sideways.
Which is why people still stand on the right and walk on the left of escalators today in London. It's because of that shunt, that you'd have people that would want to come off more quickly and then people who would want to come off less quickly. So that's how that was established.
And actually, they had to prove that the escalator would be safe. There was an organisation called the Board of Trade, who were sort of health and safety regulators back at the time, and they assessed it and said the escalator, before it opened, was exceedingly ingenious and executed with the greatest possible care. They reckoned it would be safe for up to 3 people standing on each step, which is rather more than we would expect these days, but certainly at the moment. Which could have accommodated something like 10,800 passengers per hour on the escalator. So they gave it permission to open for a month, and it was...
it's exceedingly ingenious, but we're only letting you do this for a month.
But what they needed to prove is novel technology.
Yes,
they needed to prove it was safe.
Yeah.
And indeed, they employed a guy who was nicknamed Bumper Harris to ride up and down the escalator.
Okay, that story might not be true. So there's lots of different accounts of whether or not this is true. So there's a story about Bumper Harris, who was a man who had a wooden leg, and they wanted to employ him to show that it was safe to ride for anyone, I guess. Although obviously there would still be people who couldn't ride on an escalator. There were lots of stories in different books about Bumper Harris. There are also books that say none of this was true. There are some stories that say he was paid for it, and some stories that said he wasn't paid, and then his family disputed that he was ever paid, or possibly disputed that he was ever part of this. So it's a bit unclear as to whether this is real or not. It's one of those things that I think is a lovely story and keeps being passed down, but we don't actually know where the root of it is. And as fun as these stories are, I think it's a good thing to know that the story's out there, but we haven't found any evidence that is 100% true. It's just, there's no documentary evidence of it. It's just what we've read in other books.
But, whether or not he was riding on it, it was definitely quite popular.
Yes.
And they had to have, they had somebody on the platforms of the District line shouting out, "This way to the moving staircase, the only one in London now running." And it did manage to attract a lot of passengers, some of whom were just coming to ride on the escalator because that seemed like a fun thing to do.
That's what I would do. I mean, if it was a first escalator, definitely. Absolutely.
But they only ever got a maximum of 24,000 per day rather than 10,800 per hour. So not quite as successful as the Board of Trade had maybe envisaged. But their inspector did say it was reasonably safe, despite the fact it did have a couple of casualties. So in its first operating month, they had 9 dresses torn, 1 pinched finger, and 1 person fell off his crutches.
If you say casualties, I think people always... I know casualties isn't just deaths, but I think people immediately think death.
Okay, so it wasn't quite chopping people into pieces.
Yes, which unfortunately escalators have done. But yeah, there were a few injuries, but generally, and mostly dresses getting torn. But it's interesting to think about, that would be the time shortly after that where the first women would start to wear trousers or shorter dresses. And it's interesting to think whether something like this might have been a factor in that. That's something I've never really thought about before, but it is an interesting kind of a sidebar to get into in terms of what would cause something like that. And I guess, I know that if I wear a really long dress, I'm not going to do it if I'm going on the tube because I don't want to get stuck in an escalator. So maybe that's how things work.
And the minor outbreak of the First World War a couple of years later probably helped push that along as well, I would expect.
Yes, and I guess, women's suffrage. There are all sorts of things, but I think maybe that was one thing that possibly people considered.
Suddenly there were a lot of escalators springing up very quickly after that because, the lifts that had been used on all the deep tube stations just could not cope with the number of passengers. They urgently needed something better. And escalators really solved that problem. And by the time they were testing the escalator at Earl's Court, they were already installing one at Oxford Circus. They had plans to install them within the coming years at Baker Street and Piccadilly Circus and Leicester Square and Elephant and Castle, which still hasn't got escalators, though the other places have.
110 years later. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that's quite sad because it did make the tube more accessible in a lot of ways and easier to get more people in. Of course, you got rid of the lifts, which would have been an accessibility boon. But at the same time, those lifts never, in most cases, didn't actually make it to the platform level. There was still a set of steps down to the platform level. But I do think, of course, if you're converting stations that need to have lifts, if you still had the lift shafts there, that would be handy to maybe do some conversion within them. But it is one of those things that, unfortunately, models around disability and activism around disability was not a thing at the time. And it was one of those trade-offs that's a bit unfortunate in the modern day.
Now, of course, talking of lifts, Earl's Court has another first.
Okay, we have to get in the TARDIS first, Paul.
Indeed.
So we got to go back we got to get in the TARDIS to get back to talk about lifts. So, what year was this?
We're going forwards to 1932.
1932. So this is the biggest jump we've made in this TARDIS. So we'll hop in. What have we got for this lift?
Well, when the Piccadilly line was opened at Earl's Court back in 1906, there were just lifts to go straight from street level all the way down to the platforms. And in fact, it's one of the rare stations where the lift did end directly at platform levels. You do have pretty much level access from street to the train, which is why it's a particularly accessible station today. But in the 1930s, the Underground wanted to increase the sort of capacity of the lifts and the ease of operating these lifts, because they would have been those fantastic old-fashioned lifts with those sort of Bostwick gates that look like a trellis. Often they were manually operated by a lift operator who would have to stand in the lift cabin the whole time. They would have to sort of clunk a great big lever up and down to make the lift move in the lift shaft. So it was quite a labour-intensive way of moving people around a station. So in 1932, the Underground trialled the very first automatic lifts to be used in sort of main passenger service.
What do we mean by automatic?
So automatic is the passengers would go into the lift and press a button and down it would go. Or it would be set automatically just to shuttle back up and down the lift shaft without any intervention by some person in uniform whose job was constantly operating the lift like a sort of lift driver. And then a couple of years later, the Underground tested out something else in their automatic lifts at Earl's Court, which was the first loudspeaker that would read out a warning saying, "Stand clear of the gates, please," before the doors shut and the lift started moving. And that was quite a clever little bit of technology. They'd have the sound on a film strip with a kind of light shining through it and a photoelectric cell to turn the signal into the announcement that would be read out. And they decided that actually saying "stand clear of the gates, please" was taking a bit too long, so they could speed things up by making it just say "stand clear of the gates." But to do that, what they literally did was kind of rub out the little bit of recording on the film strip. And they didn't do that quite perfectly, so the lifts ended up saying "stand clear of the gates" and blowing a little raspberry every time they were about to start off.
I quite like that. I think there's so many lifts that still do that kind of thing today. When I was delivering food during the first lockdown, and I'd go in so many lifts, it would be like level. Like, okay, I think, yeah, those were a technology that they tried for a long time. It didn't work quite that well, and eventually they got it. But I think there were years and years of trying to innovate that. So after we've seen that lift, I think it's time to hop back in our TARDIS to modern day. So for the best place to get to from the station, not by Underground, my recommendation would be the C3 bus. Now the C3 bus is a single-decker bus. And I don't normally recommend single-decker buses, but this one is a particularly interesting one. So it goes from the Tesco that's just north of Earl's Court Station, and it goes south from there. So if you want to ride it northbound, which would essentially be one stop, you'd have to go to the Warwick Road entrance. But the Earl's Court entrance, you can go southbound. And it goes kind of this twisty route through Chelsea, which not a lot of buses do. So it's quite interesting. Actually, no buses go on this particular route. It goes past Imperial Wharf Overground Station, which is also by Chelsea Harbour, and it also goes by Lots Road, which it doesn't. Lots Road Power Station is I mean, you know more about Lost Road Power Station than me, Paul, but it's one of the initial, was it the
Yeah,
initial?
it was the power station that was built by Charles Tyson Yerkes' company, the Underground Group, to power the District line when he took over and electrified that, and also the Piccadilly line, the Bakerloo line, what's now the Charing Cross branch of the Northern line. So it's the power station for all of the tube lines that he owned. And actually, linking it in with Earl's Court, of course, there was actually an underground electricity tunnel that ran from Lots Road Power Station to Earl's Court, which is where the power was fed into the District line and the Piccadilly line.
Yeah, so you don't actually pass the power station, but you do go near it. There's a stop called Lots Road, and it continues down to World's End in Chelsea, which is a weird thing, but also speaks to people in Chelsea's view of anything outside of Chelsea, I think. And then it goes across Wandsworth Bridge, and then eventually to Clapham Junction, where, first of all, there's Northcote Road, which has a lot of lovely places on it, very middle class way, lots of nice shops and restaurants, but also, Clapham Junction is
the busiest station in the country.
Yes, exactly, the busiest station in the country, which is such a boring, dull station, but there are lots of places you can go to from Clapham Junction and lots of bus connections there. So I would recommend the C3. I think it is a fun little route and an unusual one. It doesn't follow any other routes within London. And I think that brings us to the end of Earl's Court. There's a lot more we could go in with Earl's Court. I mean, there's so much to Earl's Court. But we did want to cover those sort of important historical events and a lot of the other things we could cover with other episodes about District Line or Piccadilly Line stations. So I hope we've done Earl's Court justice. Do you think we've done Earl's Court?
I think we have done Earl's Court justice, yeah.
As the second station to pull, it was really exciting, but it's also, there's a lot to it. So we've covered as much as we can, and it is time to pull out our next station. It's taken us about 3 weeks to record this episode and research and all of that. And through the entire 3 weeks, I've been like, Paul, can we just pick the other station now? We can just record that bit and add it in later. But no, he's made me be very honest. So it's time for me to pick another station now, so you can hear it, so you know that this is real. Oh, I'm nervous.
What's it going to be?
Oh, man.
Oh.
So still on the same lines.
Mm-hmm.
Another big station. In fact, 2 stations.
Oh.
Take a guess, Paul.
2 stations?
2 stations on the District and Piccadilly.
Is it King's Cross and Pancras?
No, it's on the District and Piccadilly line.
Oh.
2 stations.
Acton Town?
No, it's 2 stations. It's Hammersmith.
Oh, Hammersmith. Right, both of them.
Yes, because there are 2 Hammersmith stations. So that's going to be a big one.
That is a big one.
So we just checked our list we used originally, and there are 2 Hammersmiths in the bag. So we're going to choose one to do because Hammersmith will come up again and we can do the other one. So why did we choose this Hammersmith?
Well, we're going to go with the Hammersmith station on the Circle and Hammersmith and City lines, because that is the earlier of the 2 Hammersmith stations to have opened.
Which doesn't make logical sense to me, but then I realised there's more to it, which we can get into.
Yep.
Because it was originally part of the Metropolitan line. And I also think it's a nice variety because we've done 3 Piccadilly line stations in a row. So it's nice to have a bit of, this would be our 3rd Piccadilly line station in a row, so it'd be nice to have something different. So we will be doing the Hammersmith and City Circle Hammersmith station. How do I say that? The Hammersmith and City and Circle Hammersmith station. Okay, great.
It's a mouthful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great. Okay, we will have our next episode on that.
Thank you for joining us for Earl's Court. We hope you enjoyed it. The episode was, as all our episodes will be, at least for the time being, produced and edited and researched and everything by me, Emily Turner.
And me, Paul Burkitt-Gray.
If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, review, all those things. Also, join us on social media. We're at RoundleRoundPod on Instagram and Twitter. And you can also email us at roundleroundpod@gmail.com. And starting next week, there's going to be a listener challenge sort of thing that you can get involved with on our social medias that we will talk about here, and then you can respond on social media. So make sure you are following us. We have some wonderful art on our podcast by the Canadian-based artist Colleen McIsaac. You can find their work at Little Foible Art on Instagram. And of course, that leaves us with all the books we used.
Yes, we use quite an extensive range of sources researching each of these episodes. For episode 2 on Earl's Court, the books we used include Going Green, The Story of the District Line by Piers Connor, The District Line, An Illustrated History by Mike Horne, The Northern Line, An Illustrated History by Mike Horne and Bob Bayman. In case you're wondering, the Northern Line book for a District Line station was used for the bit about mocking up Clapham South station entrance design in the Earl's Court Exhibition Hall. A History of the Metropolitan District Railway to June 1908 by Alexander Edmonds. Underground, How the Tube Shaped London by David Bounds, Oliver Green and Sam Mullins. Amazing and Extraordinary London Underground Facts by Stephen Halliday. The Moving Metropolis, A History of London's Transport Since 1800 by David Lawrence. The Subterranean Railway, How the London Underground Was Built and How It Changed the City Forever by Christian Woolmar. Building London's Underground by Anthony Badsey Ellis. Underground Architecture by David Lawrence. Rails Through the Clay, A History of London's Tube Railways by Alan Arthur Jackson and Desmond F. Croom. London Underground at War by Nick Cooper. The London Underground Electric Train by Piers Connor. Charles Tyson Yerkes, Traction King of London by Tim Sherwood. Labyrinth, A Journey Through London's Underground by Tamsin Dillon, Will Self, Mark Wallinger, Marina Warner, Christian Wilmar and Louise Coysh. Why Do Shepherds Need a Bush? London's Underground History of Tube Station Names by David Hilliam. And What's in a Name? Origins of Station Names on the London Underground by Cyril M. Harris. We also used the website metadyne.co.uk, created by Mike Horne, and proper link to that website and details of all the books should hopefully be in the episode's details on the podcast webpage.
Yeah, in the show notes.
That's the proper word.
Yes. So thank you for joining us again. We hope you subscribe and we hope you enjoy this show, and join us again next week for Hammersmith and City and Circle Line.